Okay, hello everybody. So we're going to get started. Welcome to this month's Engel Rounds. And not only is it this month's Engel Rounds, but it's our annual lecture from our Quantitative Methods Core, or QCore, which we'll hear more about in a few minutes. And the goal of doing this really was to, have an accessible presentation on some aspect of research design, methods, statistics, something that's really relevant to anyone who reads the literature or who does research themselves. And so we had a good lecture last year, and Dr. Ian Cero is giving the presentation this year. Before we get to it, I want to mention the usual things. If you're watching this on Zoom, um, your camera and microphone are off. And if you have questions or comments, which we hope you do at the end, put them in the Q&A box, not in the chat, which was reserved for the interpreters and the other panelists. And also want to remind people, or pre-remind people, to fill out the evaluation at the end. Okay, so our presenter today, as I mentioned, is Ian Cero, who is an assistant professor here in psychiatry. He does interesting research related to several things: suicide, social networking, etc. But he also has a master's degree in statistics and does a lot of consultation or collaboration with people's projects on all kinds of different research topics. And that's a very valuable service for our department. His talk today is called From Averages to Abnormality. I wanted to mention, Ian, I preferred the original title, The History of the Mean, but this is pretty good too. So anyway, let's welcome Ian, and hopefully we'll have a good discussion at the end. All right.
Hello, everyone. So I'm told that one of my bigger presentation deficits is like going into way too much detail at the beginning and maybe like dragging out a concept any more than it needs to. So what I've done is I've tried to be very careful to include only the very important parts of the history starting 44,000 years ago. The idea that people have been doing math for about as long as we've been doing anything seems obvious once said out loud, but it's something that hadn't occurred to me until I started thinking about and reading about different mathematical objects throughout history. So you can do math in your head. There's no artifact that gets produced by that. But as soon as you write something down or attempt to document what you were doing, you might produce a mathematical object. It's worth asking, how long have we been doing that? What's the oldest mathematical object that we've discovered so far? Here you have a picture of it. It's called the Lubombo bone, from where it was discovered in Central Africa. For those of you who use God's best measurement system, which is in inches, this is about 3-ish inches. For the rest of the world, it's about 7 centimeters long. And this bone has exactly 29 notches carved along the edge of it. And so I thought we could start our discussion today by taking guesses for what archaeologists think it's for. I'll open by saying nobody really knows because we weren't around to ask the person who put this thing together. But any guesses for what might have been happening during the production of this mathematical object? Thoughts? Probably some counting. That's a good guess. So, but counting what? That's maybe a better version of my question. What would you be counting? The what? Size of something. Okay. You could also imagine like the number of something. Maybe this is like 29 times I've been on a hunt, or 29 times I've collected a particular amount of berries, like some kind of documentation. Any other guesses? What's about 29 days long? A calendar. Yeah. One of the best guesses is that this is some kind of calendar. The tricky part is figuring out exactly what kind of calendar. So lunar calendar is a good guess because the lunar month is about 29 days long. So anyone who's trying to keep track of when that glowing thing in the night in the sky becomes like big again and then goes away and comes back, there's not a whole lot to do when you don't have an iPhone. And so this might have been one of the more advanced and interesting activities you could be involved in. And there's no way to prove it. But one of the theories that I've always found most interesting is the idea that this could have been the world's first pregnancy test. The average menstrual cycle is also around 29 days long. And so this could have been a woman who was either trying to get pregnant or maybe not, we don't know, but was keeping track of the distance between how many days it had been since her last menstrual cycle if she was trying to figure out whether she was about to have a baby, which, if true, would suggest that women were among the first mathematicians in history. And I guess you would have to be among them because there's really only kind of a couple options there. But the next most recent object that we have in our mathematical history is called the Ashango bone. And it's twice as young, half as old. I don't usually have to express distances in the past like that, so I don't know how to think about it. But it's from 22,000 BCE in roughly the same area of Africa. What's different is that this is the femur of a large bovine animal, and so it has much more space for more etches. This one, it's much less obvious what it's for, shown from 4 different sides, but it'll be easier to see where the scratches are if we draw them. So these are the scratches on the bone shown in different angles, and the number of etches gets counted above and below the bone. And so you can see that you've got a 9, a 19, a collection of 21. It's unclear what this person was doing, but it is worth noting that a disproportionate number of these etches are prime. So this is one of the first examples of something that we have where someone may have been attempting to do some sort of computation, whereas the first bone was tracking something, how many times something had happened, how long it had been since something happened. This is our first piece of evidence of someone possibly trying to perform arithmetic. If we roll the clock forward, because again, I'm told that I dragged this out, we can go to the ancient Egyptians who actually had the Pythagorean theorem long before Pythagoras popularized it. So if you roll forward to about 1800 BC, on the Plimpton tablet, we see Pythagorean triples counted up over and over and over again. So the Pythagoreans were aware of triangles that are right angles and have sides that are ratioed 3, 4, and 5, which they associated with the aspects of different gods. So Osiris, Ra, and I always forget the third one. You can see the way that the Pythagorean theorem gets set up here, which is if you have a right triangle in the middle, we can label the sides A, B, and C. And if we make squares, as a reminder from middle school, if we make squares out of these different sides, the 2 smaller squares will add up to the area of the third square. Always, every time. This is an important discovery in the history of humanity because the world outside of mathematics is exceptionally random. If you try to think about what life would have been like in Egypt, where the Nile floods annually, but it floods at different times that are difficult to predict. It floods to different degrees. Child mortality is something like 50%. And the numerous ways that a human can suffer and die are all essentially inexplicable. And we discover this thing called math, where we can add up numbers and perform different operations on them. And these numbers appear to represent things in the world, right? Like there are triangles. I've seen them, I promise. And those triangles have properties that appear to exist independently of us and appear to be totally non-random. If you perform the same operation and you do it the right way, you'll get the same answer every time. And if you only know 2 pieces of information, like the length of A or the length of B, you can know with 100% certainty this third piece of information that you didn't have, which is the length of C. The idea of a proof is this intellectual anchor that if you take a step back is not something that would be a foregone conclusion that would even be possible. In a world where everything around you appears random and inconsistent and fatal, the idea that there's something stable and enduring where you can know things about the world that you wouldn't have otherwise had access to is a novel concept that the ancients attached themselves to. And they use it mostly for practical purposes. So, like I said, in Egypt, the Nile floods every year. And this is really important for the ecosystem and especially agriculture, because when the Nile floods, it brings in a bunch of nutrients over fig farms and barley farms that if it didn't get replenished every year, those farms wouldn't be as fertile. The downside, though, is that these particular farms or these particular floods also are so violent that they wash away property markers. So imagine like you have a fence indicating where your farm is and where your neighbor's farm is, and then that fence just disappears, and it disappears every single year. Property disputes become this really complicated issue. So the Egyptians develop, and we know this because Herodotus, the Greek historian, was writing about it in about 500 BC, but he's describing a process that's much older. The Egyptians had these scribes who were trained in different mathematical procedures, and they would have these long ropes of determined length and records of where the different tracts of land were and also what their areas were. So if you owned a particular tract of land, you might not get the exact same location that you got last year after your farm washed away, but you would get the same amount of land in roughly the same location, right? Because the shape of the riverbank will be different, the markers are different, but we can remember that you had something like 10 acres. And so we'll give you 10-ish acres in roughly the same place. And so these scribes would come out to the banks of the Nile each year with stakes and ropes, and they would measure essentially where your farm should be and give you the new property markers that you had for something that was a roughly equivalent area. The Greeks, when they were coming to trade with the Egyptians at this time, were a much more new, primitive, and non-intellectual culture. They hadn't sort of ascended to the way that we remember them now as philosophers and mathematicians. They observed the Egyptians walking out to the banks and measuring the ground with these ropes, and they called them earth measurers, which in Greek, geo is earth, measure is meter. They called them geometers, which is where we get the word geometry. Even the development of these concepts that we now consider like abstractions about the way that shapes and space work came from the practical necessity of figuring out how people could live through a chaotic and unpredictable world. So the Greeks borrowed all of that without much attribution to its source, which is customary and the highest form of compliment. Herodotus writes down everything that he knows about that for us in this particular papyrus, which is how we know the history of where that particular multiplication algorithm came from and where the origin of the term geometer came from. Another important mathematical object in the history of our planet is the Rhind papyrus, which was copied in roughly the same period in 1650 BCE, but is likely referencing procedures that existed much earlier. So this is, as far as we know, the world's first math textbook. And you can see it's arranged in different rows describing different mathematical procedures. It's much bigger than this, but this is just a particular problem set. And so the problems are labeled, I think there are about 100 of them. And they describe different kinds of operations that you can perform for different geometric tasks. So you can see like your triangles that are illustrated and how to calculate various aspects of those triangles. Of note is a particularly important piece of the Rhind papyrus right here, which for anyone who doesn't read hieroglyphics is describing the process of calculating the value for pi, which, as everybody knows, is an irrational number, so it can go on forever. You can't know pi. You need an algorithm for producing the digits of pi. The Egyptians thought that the way that you could get it was by taking the diameter, multiplying it times 8/9, so subtracting 1/9 of it, and then squaring the result would give you something approximating pi. That gets close. But the value that they come up with is actually 3.16. So they miss a little bit. This is also like a similar amount of error that you see in the Bible, which describes the distance across a large pool relative to its circumference. And the Bible guesses that pi is about 33.1. It estimates 31 feet halfway around the circle. So this is like a similar amount of accuracy that you see in a bunch of different texts from roughly around this time period. The Greeks, if I'm not mistaken, are the first ones to get it right by developing an algorithm that can give you sort of infinite digits of pi the longer you go. Okay. It's worth asking, though, throughout all of this, where are the statistics? I keep complaining that the world is especially chaotic. There are all of these forms of uncertainty. Statistics is the branch of math that we now think about as being focused on the documentation and management of uncertainty. Where are all of the statistical operations that seem like they would have been really useful to the ancients? Why are they not performing any of those? Why are they so obsessed with things like multiplication, ratios of distances around circles and such? Did they even know how to perform different statistical operations? And curiously, the answer seems to be yes. So the Greeks came up with a number of different formulas for different kinds of means. But again, they did it all on the basis of geometry, which is this thing that sort of felt magic to them. So you can see if I want to divide a line into two segments, A and B, I can cut the line in half, and that will give me the arithmetic mean. The way that I would figure that out is by adding the length of A and the length of B, then dividing by 2. That's the mean that we're used to, the one that we use all the time. But there are other kinds of means that get used more in economics or finance still. Those would be things like the harmonic mean or the geometric mean. The geometric mean, if you look at it on the right, you can think of as kind of like the multiplication equivalent of the addition-oriented mean. So the arithmetic mean, we add everything together and then divide by the number. And then the geometric mean, we multiply everything together. But because we've multiplied, we're not going to divide anymore. We're going to take the square root or the nth root, depending on how big you go. The Greeks weren't the only ones that had formulas for the mean. And in fact, they weren't even the first ones to have formulas for the mean. So the Dravidian Empire, I think, has it in 900 BC in India. In China, there are formulas for the mean that are used to describe sort of like practical procedures of cutting things up. The Indians use the mean to calculate the volume of irregularly sized gems. So if I have a gem that's discovered in a mine and it's not, a convenient shape like a cube or a rectangle, I can take different distances across this object and then add up those distances, multiply them together, and then divide by the number of distances that I took. And that gives you something that approximates the volume of this weirdly shaped object, which is important for figuring out what its price should be. So all of these groups had access to this formula. They clearly cared that it existed. They thought that it had interesting properties, but they never used it to summarize data, which is kind of odd because that's really all we use it for now. Any guesses for how long it takes for the mean to get used to summarize data? Ever. The first documented moment we have in history where someone used the mean in the way that we do now, like to look at a data set and say, this is the average, and so I'm concluding it's an important value. No guesses? You know it's after 900 BC. Anyone? 1400s? Okay, close. 1400s is close, but still a little early. Took a little while after that. We sailed across the Atlantic before we used the mean to summarize data. We were that averse to it. The first documented history that we have for the mean is actually in 1636, which is super late relative to the creation of this formula, relative to when it would have been useful. And it's worth taking a moment to think about why that would be. Essentially, ancient math is about certainty. It's about finding information It's about finding information in a world where everything appears to be uncertain, and these numbers appear to be related to one another in some important way that reveals something fundamental about the universe, which is often useful and sometimes even spiritual. So, for example, one of the things that we don't talk about with the Pythagoreans is that there wasn't just one guy, Pythagoras. The Pythagoreans were a group of people, and we talk about them like they were mathematicians, but really they were kind of a cult. They believed in this sort of like thick, chunky stew of like math and other sort of like vaguely religious concepts. For example, many of the Pythagoreans are documented as having thought that Pythagoras could talk to cattle. And like actually, I mean, anyone can talk to cattle, but that he could understand what they were saying back. Also, one of the other beliefs that they had was that dead souls are housed inside legumes, like beans. A weird group. It's interesting to think about what people thought Pythagoras would have said to the cattle. Maybe like don't eat beans or something like that. But in addition to doing lots of good math, they did lots of odd other kinds of stuff. For example, the Greeks didn't think about numbers in the way that we do. And in fact, if it's kind of hard to think about numbers as being anything other than abstract and pure, it's kind of hard to answer the question, how do I think about numbers? Because it's a sort of default way that we've been learned to think. Most Westerners think about numbers as being on a line, right? 0 is right in the middle, and I can go up to positive infinity and down to negative infinity, and I can subtract numbers from one another, and it gives me the distances between them on that line. I can multiply those numbers. It tells me how much more of one I have than the other. But the Egyptians and Greeks thought about numbers differently. So part of the reason that the Rind papyrus here, one thing I forgot to mention, the Rind papyrus actually contains the first documented case of a math mistake that we have. So we know how the Egyptians thought about numbers because they wrote it down in this textbook. And in one of the examples that the scribe who wrote it down uses to divide barley into different chunks among different farmers, he gets wrong. And the reason that we think he got it wrong is because the Egyptians didn't have a way of writing down numbers with different places for, tens, hundreds, and different increasing numbers of digits. Instead of writing 14, they would need to write 10 plus 4. If you wanted to write the fraction 3/4, they can't do that. You would need to write 1/2 plus 1/4 because they only accept fractions that are multiples of 2 or that are powers of 2. So they had a very different way of reasoning with numbers than we did. The Greeks were a little bit closer to the way that we think about things, but they thought about numbers as being ratios of one another. So the ratio 3/5 is special because it's it describes the relationship between the value 3 and between the value 5. There is no line of numbers where all of them live. They're sort of each their own special concept. And so the Greeks were most interested in creating ratios of numbers, which is where we get the word rational. Numbers that make sense are numbers that can be expressed as ratios of whole numbers. 4 is rational because it's 2 times 2. 2 is rational because it's 2 divided by 4. Each of those ratios forms a new number. This is a problem for the Greeks who are thinking through what different kinds of numbers there might be in the universe. So this is another example where the Pythagoreans went a little off their rocker. What about irrational numbers like pi? Initially, the Pythagoreans didn't even believe that irrational numbers were possible, that pi would eventually have to finish at some kind of fraction until Hippasus, on a boat with the rest of the Pythagoreans, draws in charcoal on the side of the boat the proof that the square root of -2 or square root of 2 is an irrational number. It never reduces to a fraction, discovering this new kind of number. And the Pythagoreans killed him. Right. Like these numbers were so important to the ancients and they were so consistent and so pure that anyone who could prove that they were odd or broken in some kind of way had committed a mortal sin, for which they were actually killed. So ancient math is about certainty and purity. statistics is a branch of mathematics that was created to confront uncertainty, which is one of the reasons that we think it may have taken so long for this branch of math to develop. The mean is not especially complicated. Using it to analyze data is about the simplest thing that you can do, but that happens right around the same time as the advent of calculus. Those ideas in the history of mathematics are equally late to develop. Okay. To give you a sense of what that must have felt like to the people who were on the edge of this discovery, it's worth looking at one of the last papers written before the mean gets used to summarize data. This is a discourse on the variation of the compass magnetical, which is a description of variation in compass measurements at a particular location in the UK, or what we would now call the UK. If you've ever used a compass before, you know that they don't always point toward true north. The dream would be that they always do, but depending on the amount of iron near you or a variety of other conditions, it can move a little bit the needle can move a little bit to the left and can move a little bit to the right. So one question is, at a particular location, how do I figure out, using my compass, how much I should adjust for? One of the things that William Burroughs wanted to do was to produce a map of England that would have +3 or -2 in all of the different locations around the country, so that if you had this map and you knew roughly where you were and you pulled out a compass, you knew how much to adjust your compass reading by. So he tries to figure out a procedure by which we could come up with all of those values. And the procedure that he uses, we roll forward in his book, is to use this combination compass/sundial, where if you don't know where true north is at any particular time, you can figure it out over the course of the day or over the course of several days by tracking where the shadows fall from the sun before and afternoon. So you wait till the sun hits its apex, you take a measurement, you adjust and try to find north from that, and you do it a couple days later, and you'll get measurements that are relatively similar. They won't be exactly the same, one, because you probably made some mistakes, and two, because the sun is moving around, or the Earth is changing its location in orientation to the sun. So what you'll end up with is this table of different measurements that you have. So on the left, you've got the moment that Burroughs thinks is right before noon. He takes a measurement, and then he takes another measurement right after the sundial starts to move in the other direction. So he's kind of got like the last minute before noon and what he thinks is the first minute after noon. And then he takes a reading on his compass and he sees how far off his compass is from what he now thinks true north is. So he's using the sun to figure out true north, and then he's measuring how wrong is my compass at this moment in time. He takes several measurements. All of those measurements are listed up here. It is notable that not all of those measurements are the same, although they're relatively close. He needs to conclude this paper, nay, book, because they didn't have word limits back then. He needs to conclude this book by figuring out like what number should you adjust your compass by at this particular location that I've been measuring. I won't do this Socratically and ask you which number that he chooses, because that would be a little bit silly. But I'll point out that he chooses 11 minutes or 11 degrees and 15 minutes, which if you want to just like eyeball, the table and this right column and try and figure out like what would have motivated him to choose that value, it's worth taking a second to reflect, because it'll also give me an excuse to drink some water. It's hard to figure out what he would have really liked about this particular number over any other number that he took, because the mean ends up being 11 degrees and 20 minutes, which is pretty close to the median and mode of the data set. The mode is 11 degrees and 22 minutes. And if you scan the book, here's what he says when he's deciding to figure out what number to choose. He says, conferring them together, I do find the true variation of the needle of compass at Limehouse to be about 11 degrees, and that would be 15 minutes would be 1/4, or 11 degrees and 1/3, which is a point. I don't quite know how to pronounce that, but that isn't a misspelling on my part. That's what's actually in the book. A notable feature of the book and other ones written around it is people just sort of seem to like make up spelling, which is a point of the compass or just a little more. So if you're trying to like read between the lines of why he chooses that number, that would be like just about like 1 point on the compass would be about 11 degrees and 1/4. But that's his best explanation for why he chooses that number. He doesn't use the mean. This number is lower than the mean, median, and mode. It's lower than what would eventually be called the mid-range. It represents no particular data summary that we know of now or in the past. As far as we can tell, it's a number that he just kind of liked. And it would be really convenient if in papers now you could do that. You could choose whichever sort of like value for a treatment effect you thought was like kind of neat or whatever. And you said, well, this is a convenient number. It rounds well. It's nice. And that is the result of my science. Thank you. I'm going to have lunch. So this is what the world looked like in science. This would have been like working in an astrophysics laser lab. This is cutting edge stuff with the most advanced technology available to humanity at the time. And you're just sort of making up numbers. It never occurs to you to summarize the data in any kind of important or systematic way. The very first instance that we have where the mean gets used to summarize data comes just a little bit later in 1636, when Henry Gillibrand is doing the same type of activity, trying to figure out how much compasses vary. And he just throws up his hands and he's like, I'm tired of all this. We can't have any variation greater than 4 degrees and 12 minutes. And the arithmetical mean linking it to 4 degrees and about 4 minutes. So he also puts together a table, which is deep in the book and I couldn't find, but he produces a table, and then concludes that the arithmetical mean, which is the modern mean that we use now, is about that much, and that's what we should conclude is the variation on the compass in this region of England. We don't know why he chose that particular moment in history to use the mean. He never says so. He just sort of claims that like that's what the summary should be. Doesn't provide any assertions or value to the mean, just says, here it is. But what's notable for our discussion today is that we go from roughly 2000 BCE, where we see the Rind papyrus describing things that look very similar to our arithmetic mean, to 1636, which is roughly 3,600 years between when we had this formula and when we used it to summarize and analyze data, which would have been right around the advent of the discovery of the derivative and the integral and other features of calculus, with Isaac Newton and Leibniz writing around this same period in history. This ushers in a new period in history where we start thinking about math a little bit differently. So before we were thinking about formulas that had certainty and then delivered certainty. Now we were forced to confront a number of different observations that we could take at different times that all appeared to be measuring some kind of phenomenon, and phenomena that we cared about, especially astronomical phenomena. But our numbers were coming up like a little bit different each time, depending on whose hand shook when they were measuring using a compass or using a telescope. And so we needed a way to get back to truth, back to what math used to be about. And the mean starts to emerge because it has properties that converge on truthiness the larger your data set gets. And so as a reminder, you can imagine that there's some kind of truth out there in the universe, some sort of true value that is the same or consistent no matter what happens, but that you can make mistakes when you're trying to measure it. So if I'm looking at the location of a particular astronomical object, or one of the major controversies around this time was how big is the solar system? And the ways that these researchers were trying to figure it out during this century was by watching Venus cross over the sun, and you can measure how long Venus's shadow takes to traverse the sun. Gives you a sense of how far away that particular planet is from both us and from the sun. But if everybody's trying to measure it with stopwatches and different kinds of tools, all of their numbers are going to be a little bit different. Someone's going to be a second longer, someone's going to be a second shorter. Someone was like maybe a little bit drunk and got it like super short. Someone was wanting to be like super ultra careful and added a second or two because they didn't want to underestimate. Which of those is the correct value? It turns out that if you take the mean of all of those observed values, eventually those positive and negative errors will cancel out, and you can see that demonstration here, right? If I take the observed values that are a result of a true value and some error that get added, then eventually my mean converges to something that is close to truth. And as long as those errors are symmetric, which is often a safe assumption, not always, your mean will eventually converge onto the exact value. This is important for the development of psychiatry because we need a way of talking about something that is especially uncertain, humans. So after Quetelet, the astronomer gets bored by all of this work that he's doing, figuring out humans' place in the universe. He wants to spend some time figuring out humans themselves. This is around the time when governments got organized enough that they started collecting more systematic census data and systematic medical data to try and manage disease and productivity in their populations. And so in the same way that the 2010s ushered in a new era of complex data analysis because now suddenly we had data available from all of our digital sources of data collection, the fact that governments were collecting consistent census data meant that there was a lot of data to be analyzed by the scientists of the day. So Quetelet is interested in what does the distribution of height look like? What's the difference of chest circumference in the average productive male? He notices that human traits follow distributions. Those distributions tend to have a bell shape, although he doesn't yet have a sense of the central limit theorem or what that particular distribution's magical properties are. But he does note that if the mean of a large number of observations about the universe converges on the truth, then the mean on a large number of people in humanity should converge on some sort of truthiness about humans, which he says is like the ideal human. I had this conversation with my sister a few days ago, and she said that, well, if that were true, then like in America, the ideal human, the ideal male at least, because Quetelet is interested in the average man, would be, like about 5'8" and a little chubby. Which seems like not super ideal. I reacted negatively and I said, I think that is quite ideal. But we can leave it to history and you can discuss amongst yourselves whether you think Quetelet was right or wrong. So the important takeaway, though, is that the average man, the theoretical average man, is not just common. To Quetelet, he's correct in the way that many repeated measurements averaged are more and more correct. Quetelet gets followed by Francis Galton, who fans of history will recognize is the creator of regression, as well as the cousin of Charles Darwin. Galton gives us this additional tool in statistics, which is the ability to quantify variation and differences. So the regression coefficient, covariance, and correlation all originate in some version with Galton. If you've ever heard the phrase regression toward the mean, or the measurement of individual differences, Galton does that. He's also the discoverer or the first person to conceive of the use of fingerprints as a way of identifying people. And what he's most known for in statistics, in addition to all of those other major contributions, is the idea of intercomparison. This will be especially important for the development of our modern understanding of psychopathology. So in other areas of science where we have sort of physical objects that we're studying, you can ask questions like, how far away is the Earth from the sun? And you can come up with an objective answer. You might be a little bit right about it. You might be a little bit wrong about it. But you believe in the idea that there is an objective distance between those two objects. If I ask you how many neutrons are in a gold atom, there is a correct answer to that. You might not know it, but you think that there is, in principle, a correct answer. If we're trying to study what makes humans behave in a particular way, and maybe we want to understand what makes them behave in ways that we like or dislike, what's the objective standard that we can compare them to? How do we say that behavior is pathological? You kind of can't. And one of the contributions that Galton makes is to say you actually don't need to. You can compare one distribution to another distribution, and then whatever scale you're comparing them on disappears. All we need to do is know, where are you in relation to some other distribution of normal people? We don't need to know what makes you normal or what makes you abnormal. We just need to know your location in statistical space. Little side note, these are my two dogs, Darwin and Galton, who are both lovely, though less mathematically inclined. In the winter, they wear sweaters. Okay. This idea is difficult to overstate. Intercomparison allows us to create things that most people in this room will have used, like t-tests, factor analysis, both early psychometrics and modern psychometrics. The very idea of clustering relies on this concept of intercomparison, that I don't need to compare people according to any kind of objective ruler out there in the universe. I just need to compare them to one another in order to come up with scientific descriptions of what they're like. You can see that on the right with these 4 distributions that represent Cohen's d at different sizes. Notice the vertical axis is unlabeled. You don't care what it is. You only care about relative heights. And notice that the x-axis is unlabeled. You don't care what you're comparing those distributions on. You can come up with a d value, the difference between their means divided by their pooled standard deviation, without knowing anything about them. The relative standard is the only thing that you need. Enter psychiatry. One of the later developed branches of medicine, we historically wanted a different model, something that would ideally be disease equals etiology, the same thing that we have in infectious disease. I know the difference between the flu and strep, not because their symptoms are always different, because in different stages they can be quite similar. I know that they're different because if I run a test, I can figure out which pathogen is inside your body. We want that in psychiatry, but it's difficult to get. Psychopathology, by its nature, lacks a clear etiology. And so we define disorders by correlation and co-occurrence among symptoms, not by where those diseases came from. The one exception in the DSM is PTSD, which has a diagnostic criterion for etiology. You have to have had a trauma. But every other disorder in the DSM, as far as I'm aware, has no etiological criterion. You diagnose on the basis of co-occurrence of symptoms alone. And if disorders are defined by co-occurrence, what makes them real? It's unclear. There is no objective standard that you can use to say that this person is pathological and that person isn't, or if there is, we don't use them very often. Instead, what we do is compare people to one another, and we compare the clustering of their behaviors to each other. At this point, I should emphasize something that we often forget, which is that our medical Bible here is not the diagnostic manual of mental disorders. It is the diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders. Originally, the reason statistical is put in the manual's title is mostly for record keeping. So the idea was hospitals and institutions needed to keep track of how many people they were treating and what they were treating them for, and they needed to be able to compare themselves to other hospitals. So the DSM would assist in the statistical tabulation of what kinds of patients were being treated. So that's true even in the DSM-1 and 2, which have a much more psychodynamic and etiological basis. They're not totally statistical documents yet, but that all changes in the DSM-3, which everyone will recall is the more statistically oriented, empirically oriented manual that quantifies diagnostic rules. You have to have 5 of these 9 symptoms to have BPD. You have to have 2 of the first 2 symptoms and then 5 of the remaining to have depression. Takeaways. The historical progression of statistics and psychiatry happens together. This all begins when we treat the mean as the norm. The mean begins as truth, then the mean becomes norm. We use variation to quantify deviation from the norm, then discover correlation among several variables, which we can use to measure the co-occurrence of different deviations from different norms together. And that co-occurrence of deviations is the basis of the way that we diagnose now. Statistics then, I argue, didn't just give psychiatry its tools. Statistics is psychiatry's ontology, at least right now. Maybe not forever, but at least it has been so far. That brings us to the QCore. There are lots of ways that the field can proceed. I personally think that although there are some disadvantages to the ways that we've thought about psychiatry in the past as just the co-occurrence of disorder, it's also the founding feature that made this field empirical. It's difficult to imagine how we would make progress without things like clinical trials or without factor analysis as being an imperfect tool, but one of the best tools that we've got so far to describe the different types of ways that people are suffering, how those forms of suffering are different from one another, and then what kinds of things we can do to mitigate them most effectively. The Quantitative Methods Core was founded a couple years ago. And is the department's internal consulting service to figure out the best ways that we can use these imperfect tools to advance our science and mitigate human suffering as rapidly as possible. We have a couple members. I am your director, Ian Cero, and also we include alphabetically Corey, Hugh, Dan, and Pat, who all have expertise in different kinds of quantitative analysis that are specifically relevant to psychiatry. And we have specialties in psychometrics, clinical trials, health economics, which I'm especially proud of, data acquisition, which is newer, and also several subject area specialties. We would like to take the history of psychiatry and move it into a more quantitatively rigorous place with the fuel provided by our clinical researchers. So the services that we offer are research-focused support. So if you have a particular type of analysis that you want to do, if you have a grant that you want to submit, if you have some data that you want analyzed that you think could represent some important innovation for the way that you can help your patients, but you don't quite know how to do it, or you're worried that you might do it wrong, we are the people who are here to help you. We are available free of charge. The only thing that you pay in is time, because there's a queue. It's a popular service, and so depending on what you're asking for, it might take us a few weeks to get to you. And we give priority to junior faculty and fellows, because the goal is to be a kind of seed or generator toward longer term projects. So if you're a fellow or junior faculty member, you're applying for a grant, and NIH is being so mean, saying that you need to have a statistician that you can't afford. You actually don't need to afford one. We're available to help you. We've supported a large number of LRPs, K23s, and R01s so far. If you need a power analysis, if a reviewer has been mean to you and you want to resubmit a grant or a paper, we are here to help. We will take care of those mean reviewers. One of the other services that we offer, as I am a licensed psychologist, is lots of emotional support throughout this process. I put this as a separate slide because this comes up so often. You don't have to apologize for your data. If you come to us and the histogram is like a little bit non-normal, or maybe there are some missing observations, or maybe you wish that it had been longitudinal, but you didn't have enough money to do a follow-up time point, like that's okay, you're not a bad person. We'll still help you. We emphasize that we are not your statistics professors, we are your statistics helpers. There's not an exam, you're not going to get graded. We're here to help, not evaluate. We have some new improvements and changes that we want to announce on the horizon. In the last year, we've expanded our contribution to more mission areas of the Department of Psychiatry. So we have a research rotation that's being supported right now in a psychiatry residency. In the past, we've also had research rotations in the psychology internship program. These would be very difficult to support without dedicated funding from Steve Silverstein, thank you so much, to the QCore, which pays for our time to be able to give statistical training to the next generation. We also have didactics in the residency curriculum for first and fourth years, as well as a large number of clinical research products and papers. But we are excited to be doing even more. Looking forward, we've just gotten additional funding for us to have continued training, and examples of that we've already taken advantage of are a certificate in AI-based research, which Pat Walsh is working on. Dan Meng is preparing to take Cosmos training, which would give him additional access to individual labeled data from Epic. I'm planning on getting additional training in computational cognitive models. And we have a couple other examples here that I can't quite remember. We're also looking to start contributing to the clinical mission of the department using our research skills. So alongside Ben Lee, Kayla Hunt, and Mark Oldham, we're investigating ways where we could use language models to reach into the e-record and find potential candidate patients that would be good candidates for the CNL service. Lastly, what I am most excited about is ongoing talks to maybe kind of sort of, but I'm really going to try hard, get a graduate student externship, which would allow us to recruit a graduate student from ideally the psychology department, but maybe another one. We would supervise that student, giving them additional training in quantitative analysis, but also expanding our capacity to analyze existing clinical data and writing for faculty who have the data, who have a good idea, but just can't find a way to get it into print. That's what I've got so far, and thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Ian. So yeah, that was like two different themes there. You know, the mean and what that means when especially in psychiatry, and also the QCore, which is possible not everybody here knew about, but it's a valuable service that's available to anyone in the department. That's been very helpful to a lot of people already. So let's see. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, well, let me ask an obvious question.
Sure.
Why did the mean get more popular than something like the median?
Sure, I can answer that right away.
The range.
We've got a question up there. Do we want to do that one first, or do you want the mean median first? Okay.
Yeah, we got to wait for the travel time here.
The answer is very consistent, and as far as I know, every statistician will agree. The mean has these very interesting algebraic properties that are better than the median or mode or range. So the lesson that you always get on the first day of statistics stops at the wrong point. You learn about mean, median, and mode. You learn that the mean is sensitive to outliers and that the median is not, so you should be using the median. That's true if all you want to do is summarize data, but if you want to make an inference about what the mean is in a population, which is usually your goal, I have a sample of data. I don't so much care about these individual people. I want to know what's the mean of disease in the world's population, everybody else that I didn't get to see. The mean is much better at converging on that truth than the median. It has much less sample-to-sample variability, which is why it became so popular.
Okay, I have part two, but let's get to some other questions.
I really enjoyed the history portion of your talk. It was just a random thought that occurred to me that the census, I think maybe the Roman Empire was conducting a census, and I was just wondering if there was any, it doesn't seem like a measurement of central tendency within that data set, that it didn't occur to them. I was wondering if there was any, I guess, data analysis attached to that piece of ancient history.
The best instances of data analysis we have from all of these like data sets that could have been analyzed is the sum, right? So the census gets conducted to figure out how much should we be taxing people. And so you want to figure out what the total amount of money that you either are taking in or should be taking in is. If you count that as a summary statistic, which I think seems reasonable, then you do get that kind of data analysis. But if your question is, would there be anything that resembles modern data analysis, that 1636 analysis of compass movements is the first one that we have that looks like what you and I would regard as data analysis. So we don't totally know why, but the best guess appears to be that the concept of a summary statistic that converges on the truth but isn't itself a member of the data set that you're analyzing is just an odd thing to think about. And its usefulness doesn't become obvious until you're trying to make very precise measurements like the movement of a planet across the sun.
George?
I guess I'll make a comment. I also enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. My comment is when you talk about the mean as the truth. I mean, I agree. You're coming at it from a statistical perspective. And my argument is that what really drives human behavior, if you think about it, are the outliers, not the mean.
Right.
What drives passion, what drives innovation, what drives the way we react to things that are not average is very different. So maybe your next presentation is the history of the outliers.
The history of the outlier? All right, you got it. We'll be back in a year.
Well, related to that thought, you were kind of, there was an implication that I guess the DSM and psychiatry in general maybe is focused on the mean as kind of what's quote unquote normal, and then outliers is what's abnormal. In your opinion, how much is that actually true versus what's considered normal is, based on religious ideas or some ideal version of, based on morality or whatever? I mean, how much of the mean really is in the DSM and how in psychiatry, and how much should it be there, do you think?
Sure. I think it was a sensible guess to spend most of the 20th century coming up with techniques for evaluating clusters of people in data. Because it was intuitive that there are forms of disease that are in the mind or in behavior. And if those exist, what we should be able to do is look at distributions of people and find something that's like a hill that's separated from the other bigger part of the data. That really could have worked out. And if it had worked out, it would have made sense to go to those people in that sort of side hill on the histogram and say what's going on with them, and then find the origin of their disease. It was a sensible gamble. It just didn't pan out because those distributions are too overlapping. And in the absence of a reason why that hill is isolated from the rest of the population, which it's not really that isolated from, these statistical tools stop working in the same way. And so I think it is a prevalent issue in the science right now, but I think statistics also offers a way out. So if we start to try to find different definitions of what productive behavior is, statistics is still the correct tool for figuring out what kind of deviations from the kind of behavior that a patient wants to be exhibiting versus the kind of behavior that they find themselves stuck in. Statistics is still the right tool for figuring out their own personal alignment with that, or our collective agreement with what's healthy and what's unhealthy.
Okay. All right. Well, we have to stop now. It's 1 minute to 1. So I want to thank Ian for his talk today, and for kind of giving us a little bit of a different flavor to Grand Rounds. Thanks again, Ian.